Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan political analysis. I am your host, Paul Rader. Hope you all had a great 4th of July weekend. Today's topic is split ticket voting. Is split ticket voting dead? How do we measure split ticket voting? What impacts our analysis of it? What does split ticket voting look like from a historical perspective, and how did it shape up in the 2024 election? Is there any cause for concern about how potentially low it is? And will split ticketing make a comeback? All this and more on tap for today's episode. But first, I didn't realize just how difficult it would be to say split ticketing multiple times. But much has been made about the frequency with which voters vote straight party on their ballots, meaning they pick the same party for every partisan contest on the ballot, because there's also some nonpartisan contests too and ballot measures. On the flip side is ticket splitting, meaning a voter picks a second party at some point on their ballot. And maybe they vote Republican for everything except one office, like a county commission where they choose a Democrat, or maybe they do it the opposite way, where Democrat on everything except for a Republican in one office. Maybe there are a bunch of offices that they vote both Republican and Democrat on. Today, we explore not only data behind split ticketing, but the more descriptive aspects of how we study it and some of the philosophical implications behind it. Is split ticketing really on the decline as much as some political observers have said? And how different or similar is it to years past? What does it all mean? Let's find out. So, a little bit more on the comparison between straight ticket voting and split ticket voting. Again, straight ticket voting just means you vote for the same party throughout the ballot. And as of October 2024, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 6 states have an option where you can choose a party without having to go all the way down the ballot. So at the top, there's a bubble you can say where I just want all the Republican candidates on the ballot, or I want all the Democratic candidates on the ballot. And those states are Alabama, Kentucky, Indiana, Michigan, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. Although Indiana did abolish the practice for at-large races only back in 2016. At-large means they represent an entire geographical unit that otherwise would be districted. Like, for example, maybe county commission represents a district, but it's voted on at large, meaning the whole county votes on it, even though they technically only represent one district. Now, even in states where that simple option of voting Republican for everything or Democrat for everything, there are still plenty of voters that vote for just one party throughout other states. Now, that straight ticket voting option, not straight ticket voting itself necessarily, that has declined in use over time. And NCSL shows 14 states have abolished it since 1994. And some examples are Georgia did it back in 1994, Illinois did it in 1997, Wisconsin in 2011, West Virginia in 2015, and then the latest was Utah in 2020. So, just a few of the arguments, real quick, both for and against having that straight ticket voting option. Arguments in favor of the straight ticket voting option, so that is the ability to mark one bubble that counts for all members of that party on the ballot. A lot of people that argue in favor of that will say that many voters just do it anyway, voting straight party, so you might as well save them the time at the polls having to go down through these ballots, because these ballots can be very long. Another argument they will use is that it mitigates the possibility of an error. So maybe if you were going to vote through the whole ballot, maybe you accidentally mark outside the bubbles, which, if you've been to the ballot box, if you mark outside the bubbles, your choice for that office is invalidated. Or maybe you incorrectly mark a candidate. Some people still put like check marks or X marks in a bubble when they're supposed to fill it in. That still happens. Or maybe they forgot about an election down the ballot, like there was a county commission that they forgot to mark a bubble for, and so their vote didn't count for that if they didn't have that straight ticket voting option. And then a third major argument is that it decreases voter fatigue, which is some voters just get tired of making choices on the ballot and will leave part of it blank. Maybe you filled out the first 10 contests, and you got to the 11th, and you're like, I don't want to freaking do this anymore. And then so you just turn it in. So straight ticket voters will say, having that straight ticket voting option right up at the top to say, I just want all Republicans, I just want all Democrats, that will mitigate all those issues. On the flip side, people arguing against the straight ticket voting option will say that this allows extremists to get more easily elected. Instead of having to go through each of these races and say, oh, wait, that candidate is crazy, you're just letting people just mark a party and not even think about that possibility. Arguments against the straight ticket voting option, another one is that it makes it even more difficult for third party candidates to win. And last week we talked about roadblocks that third party candidates face to winning elections. And then a third big argument that people make against the straight ticket voting option is that it encourages voters to be less informed at the polls about their choices because they don't have to research them. They just think, oh, okay, well, that's a Republican, that's a Democrat, I'm just going to fill in the bubble. So I normally try to keep my opinions out as much as possible, certainly about parties and individuals and ideologies and all that. I'm not going to tell you about that. I will tell you, because I have a strong opinion. And this is just my opinion on here. You are free to disagree with it if you want or to agree with it. My personal opinion about the straight ticket voting option is that it should not be allowed, but not even because of those arguments for before. My personal feeling is that you shouldn't be lazy about it. You should have to take the time to fill out each of those bubbles. And if there was a contest that somebody wasn't going to vote in, if they looked over the whole ballot, we should not be able to count their vote through just filling one bubble at the top. So if there was like a city council that somebody was voting for and you weren't going to actually fill in that bubble because maybe you were going to get tired of voting on that ballot, if you fill out that bubble at the top, you don't even have to worry about that. But if you don't have that straight ticket voting option, then you have to go all the way down there. But if you weren't going to go all the way down there, I don't think that having that straight ticket voting option should count for that election. I think you should have to take the time to fill out those bubbles. Again, you don't have to agree with that, but that's not a partisan or ideological thing. That's just something I feel particular about. But in any case, I digress. So even if you have ticket splitting or split ticketing, there are different levels to it. Any individual or geographical unit, like a precinct, could have voted for one party for every office except for one, like a school board, if the school board is partisan. A lot of school boards are not partisan, but just for the example, if it is a school board that is partisan, maybe that's the one that you decided to vote Democrat on and everything else was Republican, or maybe you voted Republican on that one, but you voted Democrat on everything else. But then you can have another person or place that splits tickets for multiple offices, as in like maybe 5 offices had a Republican and 5 offices had a Democrat that you voted for. So there's no real, when you do ticket splitting, it can get a little bit convoluted there. But speaking of which, when it comes to measuring split ticket voting, we can't look at specific ballots. We don't know which specific voters are doing the ticket splitting unless they tell you directly in like a poll, and they might be fibbing a bit with their answer. They might be saying, "Oh yeah, I split my ticket," because they don't want to seem like they're a hard-headed straight party voter. If they feel like that's the socially desirable answer to not say they voted Democrat on everything or Republican on everything, or if they're talking to other members of their party and they did split their ticket, maybe they're going to say, "Oh yeah, I totally voted for the party in every case." So you can't necessarily say, I'm not saying that there's going to be a lot of voters that do that, that a lot of them are lying about their choices, but I am saying that there can be a discrepancy between what people report and what they actually do. But in any case, you can't look at specific ballots. We do not have that access, and you certainly can't trace, even if we could, you can't trace them back to a specific person. So you can't look exactly at how people split their tickets. So instead, we have to break down our voting results by geographical units. And typically you'll see it as states. So you might see how states voted for president and then how they voted for U.S. Senate. And then you might have it broken up by congressional and state legislative districts, counties, cities, precincts. Those are the typical units that you see. And in some places, in some states and some counties, that data is going to be more easily available than in others. It might be publicly available for download on some elections administrators' websites, and in other places, it might only be available for a fee. And then what hoops they have to jump through can differ. Like if there's some sort of info you have to provide, uh, like what you're doing this for, if it's for research purposes or reporting or anything like that. And then the further you break down those geographical units, the more elections that apply. So if you're talking about statewide elections like U.S. Senate, that can be also broken down into counties and precincts because all the counties and precincts are voting for that U.S. Senate candidate. But a mayor obviously can't be looked at through a statewide lens because that mayor is only for a county or only for a city. They only have a very small subset of that state that they are running for an election for. So you can't use a statewide lens for them. So more on those geographical units. States normally for statewide races like presidents, because technically presidents are statewide races, because you have to win the electoral votes of each state or of all these states in order to get to 270 to win the U.S. presidency. U.S. Senate is always a statewide race. U.S. House, if that state only has one U.S. House rep, so those very sparsely populated states like Wyoming, for example, governor, which is statewide, a lot of other state executive offices like an attorney general, if your state votes on that, that is also going to be statewide. Then you also have state legislative and congressional districts. So congressional districts, obviously, that U.S. House rep you can look at whether the ticket was split for them and then for the U.S. Senate, because that U.S. Senate is going to be covering that congressional district as well. The county level, you can look at county-wide races like some mayors, because some counties do have mayors, or a county commission. State legislative and congressional districts, if they cover whole counties, sometimes you'll see congressional district 1 of whatever state might cover a whole county specifically, or it might only cover part of that county, which can make split ticket analysis a little bit more convoluted and difficult to do. There's also the city, so citywide races like some mayors or city councils. And then the most granular of all is precincts. And those precincts are how voters are divided into polling areas, that they must go to on election day. So if you look at your voting ID or the sample ballot that you get in the mail, you will see, okay, this is my polling place right here. That's your precinct. And there'll be usually like a 3-digit number like 113 or 340 or something like that, unless there's just that many precincts. And how each state does that, how each county does that, obviously that's going to differ considerably. But that's pretty much as granular as you can get, those precincts. And then if you're looking at election results to see where these split ticketing occurrences are, there's this overall, if you're looking overall just simply at which way did this geographical unit go, you usually just do that by a solid coloring of red or blue, red being Republican, blue being Democrat, or a different color like yellow is a lot, you see a lot of times of a third party one somewhere. Or if it's for president and you have Nebraska and Maine, which can potentially split their electoral votes, they have a unique system where it's not winner take all. It's also splits up some electoral votes by congressional districts and which presidential candidate wins the most votes in those congressional districts. That might be purple. So those are usually solid colors just to show you, hey, this party won this county or this state. It's great for quick analysis to see ultimately where candidates of the same party had similar or dissimilar success. If Donald Trump won X county, but, well, I'll use my state for example, U.S. Senator Rick Scott, if he won those same counties, you can just see, okay, which of these counties are red because they're both Republican. However, this doesn't account for the granular details of percentages. So, how much did these candidates win a county by or a state legislative district by? Then you can also look at it through the exact percentages of vote splits between candidates. So, overall simple, where did this county or this other geographical unit go? And then the exact percentages of vote splits between candidates. And usually that's done by different shades of red or blue. And so it'll be deeper or darker reds or blues if that party's candidate performed better there. So if a Democrat wins whatever county you want to talk about, they won 60 to 40%, and then they won a county right next to it by 80% to 20%, that county they won 80% of the vote in is going to be a deeper shade of blue. And this is great for diving into full details to see where these candidates should have improved relative to their party or just how well they did overall. However, this is very time consuming to do, and it's about winning places. Not necessarily of course, if you lose a county and you're running for US Senate, that's not necessarily going to tank your candidacy, but it'll probably make it a little bit more difficult, especially if it's a county that you were projected to win. Both methods are great depending on what you are trying to do. Some people just want the basic data. Your typical consumer of media just wants to say, okay, which states went red, which states went blue, which counties went red, which counties went blue, which legislative districts went red or blue. And then some people want the full details, like a campaigning organization. They're going to need the full details for their own campaigns so that they know they can try to compare strategies to see, okay, this candidate did this thing, and this is how much of the vote they got in this county. Maybe our candidate needs to do that, or maybe our candidate needs to do something different. Or does our candidate even have a chance at this county? Things like that. So, really just depends on who your audience is. Both ways can be useful for studying split ticket voting. Of course, as always in politics and the study of politics, there are some factors that complicate and limit our split ticket analysis. Some places will see higher or lower frequencies in split ticket voting beyond just the simple who are people wanting to vote for. So some factors to look at is the timing of some elections. So some elections only happen in midterm years, or only in presidential elections, or only in odd-numbered years, or in a non-November month. So if you want to look at splits in presidential elections versus gubernatorial elections, most gubernatorial elections, or governor, only happen during midterm years. So you can't compare them a whole lot to the presidency. You would have them split by 2 years, and that's not exactly a very comparable 1-to-1 ratio. Split ticketing, you're looking at the same year. And ticket splitting might fluctuate in midterms compared to presidential elections in some states anyways, because not just because of the different contests on the ballot, like we said, most governors, they get elected in midterms, but also the different kinds of voters turning out. You can generally bet those people who show up in midterms, they're probably going to show up in a presidential election. A lot of the people that show up at a presidential election aren't going to show up in a midterm because a lot of them only care about the presidential election, or they don't even know that a midterm is going on, or they find it more difficult to find information. Presidential elections always have higher turnout rates by voters than midterm elections do. And then midterm elections compared to odd numbered years typically have higher turnout rates as well. But you don't really have a whole lot of odd numbered year elections. Most of those are going to be at the local level. And then also some states, like, for example, many state senates, they only have half the chamber up for election in 1 year. And then 2 years later, the other half are up for election, and that you don't see that for a whole lot of other places. Another thing that complicates split ticket voting analysis is the number of elections on a ballot. So, in a similar vein to what we were just talking about, some election days have many more contests on the ballot than other days do, just partially depending on which offices the term for their elected official is up. And some state and local areas just generally have more elections than others. For example, if we talk about state executives like governor and attorney general and secretary of state, a state like North Carolina has a lot more of those to vote on than a place like Alaska. North Carolina has like 10 state executives to vote on, whereas Alaska only has governor and lieutenant governor. So, and also North Carolina has a bigger state legislature, more U.S. House representatives. So North Carolina is inherently going to have more opportunities for split ticket voting than a place like Alaska is going to, because North Carolina has a lot more offices that are up for election. Another issue is that there's a lack of competition in some areas. Many races, especially local ones, will only have one candidate running. Flat out, not just one party running, just one candidate completely. They are not challenged in a primary, they are not challenged in a general election, and in some cases, if the election gets decided in the primary because only one party is running candidates, they might just cancel the general election outright and just say, okay, we're not going to do this because nobody else filed for the seat except for this one person. Another factor complicating split ticket voting analysis is states that do not track voter party affiliation. Most states have the party affiliation of voters, but some states just register their voters and that's it. And the way that this complicates split ticket analysis is that knowing how many Republicans and Democrats and third party and unaffiliated voters there are, it helps for estimating the likelihood of ticket splitting. For example, you assume that ticket splitting is going to happen more in a place where Democratic and Republican voters are relatively even, or possibly if there's a lot of independents in that district or in that state. Another potential complication is that one race that is nonpartisan in one state or local area may be partisan in another state. Some state level or county judges run in partisan elections. Other ones run in a nonpartisan election. Some of them are appointed. School boards are another case where that could happen. You can't include nonpartisan races in a split ticket analysis. So if I were to say, I can't think of the states off the top of my head that do partisan races for school board, but if state A was voting on president and had partisan school board races, you can't really compare it to state B if school board races are nonpartisan because they're not partisan. So you can't look at ticket splitting. And lastly, amongst split ticket voters, you can't really see just how much tickets were split, since we can't look at individual voters to see how the ballots split. So our ability to see who heavily or lightly split their ticket is very limited. You can look at the percentages for candidates across the board and see how much they differed, like for a Republican presidential candidate versus a Republican U.S. Senate candidate versus a U.S. House candidate. But again, you can't necessarily tell like how many voters heavily split their ticket. So in that regard, it's a little bit limited, but that's okay. I mean, there's still a lot that we can get out of split ticket analysis, even with these potential complications. It's just they are things to keep in mind. So for the historical data, we're going to look at a couple of different analyses and highlight them. My own and one from Ballotpedia, the Encyclopedia of American Politics, which I've mentioned before. Full disclosure, I used to work for them, but I'll always vouch for them and the work that they do. And both of these have their own strengths. They do something a little bit different from each other, but they both get at the same basic idea as how much split ticket voting is there. So, my analysis. My analysis looks at instances where states' votes for president, U.S. Senate, and governor were not all the same party. So I'm only counting just if that state in that year voted different parties for any of those elections. So for example, here in South Dakota, there was no split ticket voting here. There was not a presidential election that year, but I was checking to see if the governor and U.S. Senate split. Or a couple of other states like Utah here in 2016. So you can see this if you're on YouTube, but if you're on another place like Spotify or Apple Podcast, I will try to describe this as best as possible. And I'm looking only from 1854 onward, since that's when elections became Democratic versus Republican. And then also, I had a split from 1959 onward, since that is when when we became 50 states. So each state is a little bit more comparable in that regard. But I also included midterms where it was just a U.S. Senate and or a governor, because I wanted to not just compare presidential elections. I wanted to see, okay, in midterm elections or maybe in odd numbered years, was there a split ticket occurrence? So this is looking at every single year. And special elections that might have been in the same year, but possibly not on the same exact date as the regular elections, there might be a couple of those here, but as far as I know, that's not the case for any of these. And in any case, that those are very few of those cases anyways. So the exact results. On average per state since 1854, there have been 12 to 13 instances of ticket splitting. And then since 1959, that number was closer to 8. Obviously, much less time in that regard. So the average times that you've seen ticket splitting is going to be a lot less than if you count another extra 100 years. The lowest 5 states in terms of total ticket splitting instances. Hawaii had 4 years where they had ticket splitting. Mississippi also had 4. Kentucky had 5. Virginia had 5. And Texas had 7. And for the highest 5, actually 6, because there were 2 tied for 5, or for 5th place, excuse me, in terms of total splits or ticket splitting instances, Massachusetts had 23 of those instances, North Dakota had 21, Minnesota had 20, Montana had 20, Maine had 19, and New Hampshire had 19 as well. And then if we take just splits from 1959 onwards, the lowest 5, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Virginia were tied for first with 3. And then Hawaii, New Jersey, Texas, and Utah were tied for fourth with 4 ticket splitting instances. And then on the high end, we have, in terms of since 1959 again, the most ticket splitting instances was Vermont with 17. That was followed by New Hampshire with 14, Maine with 13, Montana with 13, and then Massachusetts, North Dakota, Rhode Island, Nevada, and Arkansas had 11. Now, if we want to look at it in decades, not necessarily by state, there were very few states that had ticket splitting instances in a given year in the second half of the 1800s. In fact, there's only 2 times it happened in the 1850s, although, again, that's when the Republican Party came into existence, so I didn't account for Whigs versus Democrats, for example. And also partly because there were fewer states in the Union at that time. But it started to climb up a little bit through the 1900s, the 19 teens, the 1920s, 1930s, and then it got up higher in the 1940s and 1950s, and then really reached the high water mark in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. 90s and 2000s, the aughts, started to go back down a little bit, and then in the 2010s, 20 teens, and the 2020s, it has come down a lot more. So split ticket voting by decade has steadily climbed up into the 70s and 80s thereabouts, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and has trended downward since then, especially dropping dramatically in the 2010s and 2020s, at least so far. Maybe the rest of the decade will show something a little bit different. And now for Ballotpedia's analysis, and they have a nifty little chart for you to look at here. They look at presidential elections only from 1916 to 2024, and they call these mixed party election outcomes. They take which party won that state for president and then sees if a different party or not won a U.S. Senate seat, a majority of the state's U.S. House delegation, a state Senate majority, or a state House majority in that state. And they count each time that occurred. Whereas my analysis was just looking to see if a split ticket voting instance occurred in that state in that year, yes or no. This is looking at the specific times, or the number of times rather, that this has happened in Ballotpedia's analysis. So the general result is there's a general trend up and down, trending upward from about the 1920s to the 1980s, then dropping off quite a bit in the 90s and early 2000s, and then really dropping off in the last 10, 15 years. And almost every year here had 160 to 170 potential outcomes for mixed party results. For example, if that state had a U.S. Senate seat up in that year, or if the U.S. House delegation was not an even number so that you could win a majority of that U.S. House delegation for a given state. So in 2024, if a state voted for Donald Trump for president as a Republican, or if it voted for Kamala Harris as a Democrat, these are all the instances where a U.S. Senate seat, majority of a U.S. House delegation, majority of a state Senate, or a majority of a state House went the opposite direction. For the U.S. House delegations, we mean for a specific state now. So anytime I talk about a mixed party election outcome on this Ballotpedia analysis, it's talking about any time that the party that won a state for the U.S. presidency, how that state differed in how it voted for U.S. Senate, U.S. House majority delegation, state Senate majority, state House majority. Those are always compared to which party won that state for president. So, when it comes to U.S. Senate, there were the fewest instances of mixed party election outcomes was 0 in 2016. On the high end, there were 17 mixed party election outcomes for U.S. Senate in 1972, 1984, and 1988. When it comes to U.S. House delegation majorities, on the low end, there was one mixed party outcome in 1920 and 2024. And on the high end, there were 28 mixed party outcomes in 1984 for the U.S. House. For state Senate majorities, there were two mixed party election outcomes in 1920 and 2024. And on the high end, there were 24 mixed party election outcomes for state Senate majorities in 1984. And then lastly, for state House majorities, there were two mixed party election outcomes in 1924, 2016, and 2024. And on the high end, there were 28 mixed party election outcomes for state House majorities in 1984. Now, finally, percentage total here, where the percentage of total possibilities that there could have been a mixed party election outcome, how many times was there a mixed party election outcome? And that's counting all of the instances for U.S. Senate, U.S. House, state Senate majorities, and state House majorities. And in 1920 was the lowest percentage of mixed party election outcomes with 4.3%. And on the high end, 1984, where there was 58.4% of the time that there could have been a mixed party election outcome, there was a mixed party election outcome. Now, as for which states had the fewest and most mixed party election outcomes for that whole time frame of 1916 to 2024, the top 5 states mixed party election outcomes from 1916 to 2024. Oklahoma had 43. Florida had 42. Tennessee had 40. Oregon had 39. and Nevada had 38. And then on the low end, the states with the 5 fewest times that there were mixed party election outcomes from 1916 to 2024, Nebraska with 6, and that's partly because it only has a state senate. There is no state house in Nebraska, and also that state senate is nonpartisan. So there's inherently much fewer opportunities for mixed party election outcomes and split ticket voting in Nebraska than there is in most other states. So Nebraska was the fewest with 6 mixed party election outcomes from 1916 to 2024. Utah was next with 7. Alabama was next with 8. Maryland was next with 9. And then Mississippi at 5th with 10. So what are the big takeaways overall with split ticket voting from both of those analyses? The differences being I used governorships and every year from 1854 to the present, so that's including odd-numbered years and midterm elections. Ballotpedia used majorities of U.S. House delegations, state House majorities, and state Senate majorities, and only presidential election years. Both of them have their own strengths. And also, I'm just counting if there was a split ticket occurrence at all in a year, not counting the number of times that a ticket was split. And Ballotpedia is counting the number of times within a year that a party won the presidency, but a different party won something else that they were measuring. But despite the differences, the analyses more or less find the same general trend, in that there was very little ticket splitting in the very early 1900s, started to climb up a little bit in the 1920s and the 1940s, climbing up again in the 1950s and 1960s, and the highest marks in the 70s and 80s, or maybe even the 60s as well, dropped down quite a bit in the 1990s and 2000s, and then really dropped off afterwards to the low rates of split ticket voting that we see today. Speaking of today, let's look at the 2024 election specifically. Using my analysis and Ballotpedia's, again, quick recap, mine is seeing if there was a split at all in a year between presidential, U.S. Senate, and gubernatorial vote, the governor vote, in a state. Ballotpedia is looking at which offices out of the U.S. Senate, U.S. House delegation majority, state House majority, and state Senate majority differed from the presidential vote. Whichever analyses you use, whether it's mine or Ballotpedia's or another one, you're going to find little ticket splitting in 2024, at least compared to previous years, most previous years. In my analysis, there were 7 states where there was a split ticket occurrence between president, U.S. Senate, and or governor. Those were Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Vermont, and Wisconsin. In Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin's case, they voted Democratic for U.S. Senate and then Republican for president. In New Hampshire, it was a Republican for governor and a Democrat for president. North Carolina was a Democrat for governor and Republican for president. And in Vermont, it was Republican for governor, independent for U.S. Senate, and Democrat for president. And then in Ballotpedia's analysis, there were 5 states where there was a split ticket for president, and at least one of those other offices they looked at: U.S. Senate, U.S. House delegation majority, state House majority, and state Senate majority. And those 5 states were Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin. And in Nevada, that led with 4 mixed party outcomes where it voted Republican for president, but Democratic for U.S. Senate, U.S. House delegation majority, state House majority, state Senate majority. New Hampshire had 2 mixed party election outcomes: Democrat for president, Republican for state House and state Senate majority. And in Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin, there was 1 mixed party outcome where they voted Republican for president, but then Democrat for U.S. Senate. So, any way you cut it, split ticket voting has gone down quite a bit in the past 10 to 15 years. The high watermarks were the 60s, 70s, 80s, that general time frame, and then really coming down a lot since then. So that leads us to talking about the future of split ticket voting. And here I want to be careful and not say voting straight party is inherently wrong. I try to keep my opinions out as much as possible. It's not the whole voting straight party that I think is a problem. And it's not because of what I personally think or don't think about the parties or independence or anything like that. It's about my concerns about tribalism, groupthink, staying within our silos and never entertaining other possibilities, never branching out. We can't grow personally or collectively if we don't at least hear what other people have to say or think about how to do things in a different way, and at least say, okay, maybe I'll do something a little bit different. So, not even if you come to the conclusion on your own that I need to vote straight party because I think all these candidates are for this party are better, then you do you. I just have a concern about just voting for them because they're that party. I think that is a problem. But it's not, it doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican or for independents. Just voting independent doesn't inherently make things better either. Try to look beyond what that affiliation is. So split ticket voting is not dead, but it is concerning how infrequent it has become, and especially during Donald Trump's terms in office and even between his terms in office. By some measures, split ticket voting has not been this low in a century. And it's become increasingly common to see, if you look at geographical maps of voting along Democratic and Republican lines for different offices, they look quite similar in a lot of cases. Like if you look at a lot of US Senate voting maps compared to the presidential voting map, there is a lot of similarities there. There's a lot of similarities in how the counties vote and in how the state legislative districts vote. But split ticketing is still there, and it's still going to exist somewhere. It has to. There's just it's too diverse of a country that we have here where it's all going to be one party the exact same way across all of these elections. Some precincts and counties and states are just going to demonstrate that. Sometimes you won't really notice it with the states, but you will still see it with some precincts and counties. And in some odd numbered years, sure, there will be often very little ticket splitting, but that's because there's also much fewer offices that are up for election then. And so midterms and presidential elections will have the bulk of ticket splitting, but some ticket splitting analyses don't use odd numbered years anyways. They just look at midterms and presidential elections, if they even look at midterms. The more appropriate question is not if ticket splitting still exists, because it does still exist, but it's more if and when split ticket voting will start to go back up. Will unaffiliated voters become a more potent force in swinging elections toward multiple party paths? Some independents split their tickets, some still vote for one party, like you would expect from maybe some strongly affiliated Republicans and Democrats. Will third parties become more competitive? And I'll refer again to my previous episode that I had, which was about third party competitiveness and whether there's a realistic chance of them becoming more strongly competitive in the near future. And also, regardless of that, the Democratic and Republican parties are remarkably adaptive. I mean, they've been around for 170. Well, the Republican Party's been around for 170 years. Democratic Party has actually been around since almost since the founding of this country. But the parties are remarkably adaptive to this ever-changing political landscape as a whole. One may be a little slower to adapt to the times, but eventually they do. And then the other one starts to fall behind. And it kind of goes in a cycle. It's done that several different times. So in short, I think ticket splitting will definitively go back up eventually. I mean, it can't go much further down than it has now, but it might take a couple elections. It might not be till after Donald Trump leaves office, given how unified Republicans have been for him and Democrats have been against him. Might take a little while for that ticket splitting to pick back up again. But at some point, party realignments are going to happen again. And party realignments refer to fluctuations in which demographics make up which parties. So racial lines, religious lines, gender lines, for example. If that party realignment hasn't happened now, some people say that Donald Trump has realigned the parties. That's a topic for another episode. But in any case, ticket splitting might take a little bit to come back up, but I think it will at some point. So, is ticket splitting dead? No. But hopefully it will start to go back up at least a little bit in the near future. If only just because we don't want too much tribalism and groupthink going on. But we shall see. But that's going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share the podcast. Links in the show notes, my Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my LinkedIn profile, my medium.com profile, where I post about political science from time to time, including for these episodes, my Matchmaker FM profile, if you want to potentially be a guest on this podcast or have me as a guest on your podcast, and my educational email course about how we can more effectively depolarize American politics, and my email, Paul Rader Writes, as in writing, at gmail.com. And that is going to do it. So, as always, thank you again, and until next time, take care.